Okay, so let's populate the shareholders equity schedule now. In this case, the row 71 shows the common stock issued at par and 72 is additional paid-in capital. Since there is no additional shares being issued to existing stockholders, you can just keep the common stock issued at par and additional paid-in capital to existing shareholders constant, because no new shares are being issued. As far as the common stock issued at par to SAS and the additional paid-in capital, that's something that we've already calculated in our shareholders equity schedule. So you can just simply link those over here and make sure that the links are green. The accumulated earnings are the previous year's balance plus the net income and minus the dividends. I'm not taking a minus sign over there because I will be keeping my dividends as negative numbers. And that helps you get the total shareholders equity. And now, of course, at this stage, we will be at a point where our balance sheet will not be balanced because we have not finished populating the cash flow statement. And this is really the last step that lets you get to the balanced model. So let's jump right into getting the balance sheet to balance. So to get from net income to cash flow from operation, you will do net income plus depreciation, and then you will account for changes in working capital. As I said earlier, an increase in accounts receivable, which is what we are seeing between 2008 and 2009, should be coming up as a negative number, because an increase in accounts receivable is a negative for cash. Then similarly, decrease in other current assets, even though this is a bit surprising why there is a decrease in other current assets. I'm going to check really quickly why this happened, and I will do that by following this link in cell 48, doing control open square bracket, and I'm going to see that, and I realize that my other current assets actually should have been linked to revenue, and they had been linked to operating costs. And so I've managed to pick a fault already because some numbers seemed a bit strange. Now that I have populated my changes in accounts receivable and other current assets, I'm going to do the same with accounts payable. And with payables, you need to remember that when a payable is increasing, that is positive for cash. And that, so simply the cash flow statement is recording the changes in balance sheet. That's why you're seeing me take current year's balance minus the previous year's balance. Some people like to go the other way. They first populate the cash flow statement and then build the balance sheet as changes in cash flow statement. They are both perfectly acceptable techniques. For the capital expenditures, we had already populated them in our capital expenditure and depreciation schedule. So we're going to go back to that schedule and link these capital expenditures. And since they are links, we're going to make them green, copy right, copy down. And we have now arrived at cash flow from investing activities. Since we are not raising any debt or issuing common stock to existing shareholders, we can forget about rows 103 to 105. But in this proceeds from equity raised from foreign investor, which is SAS, we are going to go to our shareholders equity schedule and sum up the additional paid-in capital and the common shares issued. The dividends we've calculated in our shareholders equity schedule. And for the payments and secured debt, you can either use the existing balance sheet and just take the changes from one year to another, or you can go to the debt and interest schedule. They're both doing the same thing. And cash flow from operations minus cash flow from investing and plus cash flow from financing gives you the change in cash balance. And when you take this change in cash balance and add it to the previous year's cash balance, you will end up balancing the balance sheet. The balance sheet is balanced. You can see, this is where you can see that there is a 30 million balance that is not, that we're off by 30 million. And that's because I did not carry over the, and this is important, right? A balance sheet represents a snapshot at a point in time. The airport raised money from SAS in 2009, but that money still remained in 2008. I had just not shown it correctly in the balance sheet, which is why the balancing was out. A lot of times, I obviously knew with what steps I was doing. A lot of times, the balancing does not happen, and the thing to remember in balance sheet, whenever you don't have a balanced balance sheet, is you want to carry out an exercise to isolate the problem. And generally, the way you isolate the problem is as follows. You say, okay, let me start making sure that I have accounted my receivables and payables correctly. So if you go to, let's say you start with the receivables and you do control open square bracket on the receivables, and you will see that, okay, I'm documenting these correctly. And so you could potentially color code these as green, saying there is no fault over here, and I can proceed to another line item. And like this, if you keep going line item by line item, you can start isolating errors. This is the most effective way that I have learned to isolate errors, because what ends up happening to analysts, particularly when they're first starting out, is when they see an error, they just kind of go in a pretty haphazard way, trying to say, oh, maybe the error is in the balance sheet, maybe the error is in the debt schedule. Take this approach of isolating the error. It can become a bit overwhelming when you're looking at an unbalanced model, but when you take an approach of isolating an error, that's when you can ensure that you never have to go back to having checked one particular line item. That's really where a lot of time gets wasted, when you keep going back to a task that you've already checked. And it's really important to be methodical and to never have to go back. We've now completed the balance sheet and cash flow statement, and we've built the financial model, but this financial model currently isn't very useful because it's not informing our client in any way whether the investment makes sense or it does not make sense. And so for that, we need to do a basic returns analysis, and then finally put all of that on a control page or a dashboard. And when we start populating the dashboard, you're going to see that the best practices that we followed were why they matter. So let's do the returns analysis. To do the returns analysis, we need EBITDA, which we can get from our financial model step 0. And we need an assumption on EBITDA, call it 7 times. And enterprise value to EBITDA is a pretty popular metric. And so if we were to multiply EBITDA by an EBITDA multiple, that will tell us what the forecasted enterprise value is. And clearly I anchored the wrong cell over there. Happens when you're not paying attention to which cell to anchor. I have my forecast of my debt from my financial model step 0. And in this, I am going to since this is a link, I want to make sure that, and I don't want a decimal point, so I'm just going to get rid of that decimal point. And for the cash, I'm going to again go back to my financial model step 0 and add in the cash. Because to go from enterprise value to equity value, you subtract the debt and you add the cash, and that is what gives you equity value. And we want to see what we obviously want to calculate, what is our percentage, and our percentage is coming from valuation considerations. And that is obviously going to be a function of the price that we are paying. Alt HP helps us make this a percentage, Alt HFAC helps us get it centered. And so our equity value is expected to grow as follows. Again, I got the anchoring wrong. I was supposed to anchor. This is interesting. Because I am not calculating my equity value correctly. That's what happened. And similarly, my share of dividends is also going to be my ownership multiplied by whatever dividends are being declared in total. Right. And now I'm finally at a point where I can start calculating the internal rate of return. I can see that what is my 30 million, what is going to be the return on my 30 million investment if I sold immediately in 2009, if I sold in 2010, if I sold in 2011, if I sold in 2012. And so the formula for IRR is quite simple. It's equals to IRR, open bracket. The first item has to be a negative, which is showing that this is an investment, and then you select the remaining items where you are showing positive cash flows. And you will take this formula and you will just copy it down. Now, if you were to copy this down the way we've been currently copying it down, you'll see that this formatting bar is going to go away. If you want to make sure that you don't want to mess around with the formatting, one thing you can do is copy a formula, select the box where you want the cell copied, do Alt ES for paste special and press F for formulas. This will ensure that you are only copying the formulas and not the formatting. The one thing to keep in mind is IRR is sensitive to blanks. So for example, if somehow a 0 just appeared in row or cell I-27, this IRR will change because it will assume that that is also a period. So the IRR formula thinks that a blank cell is not a period, but a populated cell is a period. If you ever are dealing with non-annualized periods, you should be using the formula XIRR, which lets you pick out the dates with the corresponding cash flows. Now that we have made the returns analysis, we are finally in a position to rejig this model and make it useful, make it such that we can actually start playing with We can start playing with some assumptions to see, to make sense of all this analysis that we've done. And so this is where best practices become really handy, because now that I've marked my inputs and my links cleanly, I can move inputs to this control page and also move specific outputs to this control page, and then let my user play around with certain key assumptions to see whether they want to or not want to make this investment. So let's start moving inputs. Some of this is going to appear familiar to you. So I'm going to start by going to my operating model, step 0, and I'm going to pick up some of the assumptions over there and repaste them in my control page setup. Currently, these assumptions are doing nothing in control page, but when I link the operating model tab to control page, these inputs will start driving the rest of the model and the rest of the output. So we will continue this exercise of moving inputs. We will continue this exercise of moving inputs. And these are the traffic movements that I want to and these are some of my key financials that I can just get from my financial model step 0. My total revenue. Oh, that was a mistake. My total revenue, my EBITDA. And don't get worried if this number shows up here and not here. It's because there's a center across selection that's happening. If you ever get baffled by why I'm linking it in cell F25, but this number is showing in I25, just do Alt H AC, and it's that formatting is going to get fixed. Net income, again from, and finally cash and cash equivalents. And the investment amount I'll get from valuation considerations, and also the share price I'll get from valuation considerations. The current stock price is what it is. I can just link it. And the premium paid is just going to be the difference between these two. The additional shares I can actually now just calculate by taking 30 million divided by 2.8. I can make this black because, and the current shares outstanding, I can get it from the valuation considerations, and the common shares issued is just the sum of the above two. And so the ownership of SAS is just their shares divided by the total shares post. Since I want to now play around with the EBITDA multiple, I'm going to input a number over here and now link in the returns analysis. And in this, now finally link in the exit amounts. Now, at this stage, if you were to change the EBITDA multiple, or if you were to change some of the aircraft traffic movements, none of the outputs will change. And that's because you haven't changed the plumbing of the model. And this is where the final step comes in. This is where best practices are critical. So you see, currently in operating model step 0, the aircraft traffic movements are inputs, but right now we want to turn them into links. Now we want to turn them into links and connect them to the control page. When we connect them to the control page, we want these things to become green. And now that these have become links, now if you were to, let's say, change your aircraft traffic movements, you'll see that the IRR changes. Now you're beginning to make this model useful. Now finally you are doing some work to help fulfill this model's purpose, which was to help SAS figure out whether they should be doing this deal or not. And cannot stress that enough. You must be very clear why you are building a financial model. What steps do you want the user to take? If you don't have these questions answered, I can assure you, you will create a highly complicated model and you're going to waste a lot of time. So I want to copy the formulas, and then I want to make all of this green. And I want to do the same thing with these I want to make this green. And I hope this is becoming clearer that I'm moving inputs, but my control is come to a different sheet. And the more you can condense inputs and outputs on the same sheet, the easier time you will have performing analyses. So for example, you know, in your valuation considerations or in your in your returns analysis, take that exit multiple and link it to the control page. Oops. And make sure you make this green. Right now, when you were to change this, if you were to change this multiple, you'll be able to see how the return is changing. Lastly, let's do the same thing with the investment amount and the offer price per share. And so there are these two amazing auditing keys, Alt-TUT to trace precedents and Alt-TUD to trace dependents. And this, when you click on, unfortunately there's no keyboard shortcut for this, but when you click on this dotted line, it takes you to where the dependent is. And right now I wanted to color code my dependent screen, which is why I have come back to this cell. And now we can actually start advising our client that, okay, if you bid $2 a share, this is how your returns will look like. If or 2 rupees a share, if you bid 4 rupees a share, this is what your returns will look like. And here you can start getting a bit more creative as well, right? Like in the earlier dashboard, I showed you that you could insert a button, and so all the buttons that give you that functionality are in this developer tab. So if you were to go to the developer tab and you were to go to insert controls and you were to let's say pick this spin button and connect this spin button to the EBITDA multiple, right click on that spin button, click on format control, click on cell link, and then click the cell that you want controlled by this spin button. You will now be able to change the EBITDA multiple using using a button. And I hope the rest you can imagine, right? From this point, if you were to make a little graph for IRRs in different period, or for or some other metric, you can then start getting creative with how you want to finish off this dashboard. And that's kind of it. That's all that's these are all the basics that you need to complete a financial model. I really hope you've enjoyed going through this exercise. I'm going to be carrying out a series of these tutorials. This is just the introduction, and it's meant to do the following. If we were to just go back to what did I want you to achieve in